Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. Today I'm sharing September clubs for Spellbinders for 2025. First we have the Wax Seal of the Month. This is Twilight Hoot and it's perfect for the fall theme as well as the must-have wax beads. Then we have the embossing folder of the month called Autumn Breeze, full of fall leaves, again perfect for fall, and the 3D embossing folder called Patchwork. It looks like a quilt to me, so it's perfectly named. This is the stencil of the month called Acorns and Oaks. And this is the glimmer of the month called Gilded Weave. And along with it, we have some copper glimmer foil. And I'm going to foil both the glimmer of the month as well as the BetterPress of the month, which is right here. This is called Sketchy Hexie. And then we have our stitching die of the month, which is Stitch Pumpkin Tops. Again, perfect for fall, perfect for Halloween. This is the die of the month called Harvest Magic. And I'm going to be making 2 cards with it. One of the cards is going to combine the die of the month as well as this large die of the month. This is called Acorn Acres, and again, perfect for fall. An adorable little acorn home with a chipmunk, as well as tiny little acorns and then fall leaves. This is the clear stamp as well as the coordinating die of the month called Autumn Whim. And the caboodle of the month is a stencil set that goes with that clear stamp of the month. So I'm going to be using that for coloring in those images. This is the color palette that is my inspiration from the DIY color deck. I will be adding some more colors to it because there's a few in that color palette that I needed a few more. So I'm going to start off by making my wax seals. I had my beginner wax kit here that I've opened up and I've got my wax melting. From that must-have wax mix, I'm only using the gold beads. It's the color that's going to work best with the color palettes that I'm using for the cards. So after melting my wax, I stir it and I just use a toothpick to stir it. I keep those toothpicks with my wax starter kit and they're just a nice inexpensive way to mix it up. I take some of the excess of that wax off as I mix it up so I don't have it build up on there. Once my seal is done, I'm using a black POSCA marker for coloring in the details of the owl. I'm making a few wax seals. I think I ended up making 4. I used 3 on the cards. Some of them I color with the POSCA marker, some of them I don't. I always like having options, so I have some with and some without. The black is a little bit stark for the color palette I'm using. If I had a dark brown, I would have used that. I think it would have worked a little bit better for some of the cards, but by having some of the wax seals without having the colored in owl, it works perfectly. Once I'm done creating my wax seals, and I only showed 1 here because this video is already going to be fairly long, I put everything away. I have these storage kits from Spellbinders that I use to store both my handles as well as the heads of the wax stamps. Next, I'm going to use my Glimmer machine to do my foiling. I'm doing it with that copper foil that comes with that Glimmer of the month. I will be foiling on Hammermill Cardstock. It's my favorite thing to foil on. Typically, if I want something colored, you can use the Spellbinders colored cardstock, but typically I'll use white cardstock because I find I get the best results from it. And then I can always ink blend over it. That foil resists that ink, and then I can customize it or do ink blends if I want that look to it. Like I mentioned earlier, I'm going to be foiling both the Glimmer of the month as well as the BetterPress of the month, and I'm also going to be foiling the sentiments that come with each one of these. While I have that Glimmer system out, I might as well do all of this at once rather than change my mind afterwards. I end up not using the foiled Glimmer of the month. I do something else with that plate, and I end up liking that better for both the color palette as well as the kind of look that I'm going for. You could always use a different color of foil. I think if I had foiled this in, say, a matte gold, it would have worked better with the color palettes and just the overall feel of the cards that I wanted to create. But like I said, in the end, I do something else with my Glimmer plate, and I will share that with you in just a little bit. So after foiling my Glimmer of the month, I foil the sentiments that go with it. And because there's only 2 sentiments there, I've just cut my quarter sheet of Hammermill cardstock in half, and I have a smaller piece of foil there. I'm also going to be doing the solid hot foiling of each of these, so we're going to get dual duty for those sentiments. Now, one of the sentiments didn't foil really well. I'll show you how to fix that in just a moment. It's not going to do anything for fixing the solid hot foil sentiments. That won't be able to be used, but I will be able to fix, clean up, and use the regular foil sentiments. So with my Glimmer of the Month done, now I'm ready to foil my BetterPress of the month. So I foil that on the Hammermill cardstock as well, and I really love the way it turned out. It's got a really cool look to it. This also has a hexagon die in this set. I'm going to be using that with this foiled background for my first card. The funny thing is when starting this, I just wanted to see what the foiled BetterPress of the month looked like. I didn't actually think I was going to use it, but I ended up making my first card with it because I just thought it looked really cool. Once I did the background, then I foiled my sentiments, and just like the Glimmer of the Month sentiments, one of these, it's always the bottom one it seems, and it must be just the way that I run it through my die cutting machine. It didn't foil well. Again, I can fix and clean up the regular foil. I can't clean up the solid hot foil because that foil is no longer on that little carrier sheet or that backing sheet, but that's okay. So once I have my foiling done, I pull out the solid hot foil plate, and then I do all of my solid hot foil. I always love seeing the difference between the regular foil and solid hot foil. Sometimes I'll like the solid one better. Sometimes I will use them as mats around different things that I'm creating. And I do that with my first card with using that BetterPress of the month. I will use one of them as mats, one of them as the front layer, and then one I'm going to die cut, and that will make sense in just a moment. After doing my solid hot foiling of that BetterPress of the month, I'm ready to do the sentiments, and I just do them both on the same Hammermill piece of cardstock, and then I will just use my trimmer to trim them down. Neither of the sentiments for the BetterPress of the month or the Glimmer of the month have dies that go with it. You could probably pull out coordinating die, like strip dies from previous sets, and that will probably work. I just pull out my guillotine trimmer and just use that, and it works perfectly. So the first thing I typically do when I'm cleaning up my foiling is I use the Best Ever Craft tape. I take a piece, and I usually use the 5/8 one. I like the one that's a little bit thicker for this. I put it on my shirt or my pants just to take a tiny little bit of the stick off of it. If it's a bit too sticky, sometimes it'll pull up some paper, but by taking some of that excess stick off, you reduce the risk of that happening. After taking the excess stick off, I've never had it rip any paper. So I always like to do that just to make sure that I can use a little bit more pressure when I'm using the tape. So I use that on the sentiment till I find that it's not taking any of the excess foil off. And then once I'm done using the Best Ever Craft tape, then I'll go and use a Tombow sand eraser. That's a little bit more abrasive on the cardstock. It lifts the upper level or the upper layer of the cardstock off, and that's how it cleans up that foil. So especially for things like this, for sentiments, you do need to be fairly careful with it. If you do it over a part of foil that you want to keep, it does change the finish of it. So I typically will use the edge or the corner depending on what I am sanding, and I'm just really careful when I'm doing the sentiments. Now, because my copper foil is fairly dark and the Hammermill cardstock obviously is white, it is absolutely not perfect. If you look at it closely, you see little bits of that foil, but I plan on doing ink blending on these, and that's going to hide any of the residue that is left. It doesn't need to be perfect for the look that I'm going for what I'm going to be doing with it. And just know that that's what happens, especially when you're using a really dark foil against white cardstock. It's really hard to get it perfect, especially with sentiments, because there's so many little tiny areas that it's really hard to get into all of them. So I just keep working at it and do my best to get it as clean as possible, knowing that I am going to be doing ink blending on most of them. And if there's one that I'm not doing ink blending on, I will choose one that I didn't have to use the sand eraser on, one that's already cleaned up all on its own. And these are not the only sentiments I'm going to be using in this video. The clear stamp of the month has a bunch of sentiments, and I'm going to be stamping them all at once and then die cutting them with the coordinating dies, just so I have a lot of choice while I'm creating. So I keep working at this, cleaning up the sentiments until I am totally done. It takes a few moments. It really doesn't take too long, but it always is great to be able to clean something up that wasn't perfect when you created it so that you can actually use it. So I keep looking closely to see if there's anything I need to touch up a little bit more. So once I'm completely done with it, then I pull out my guillotine trimmer and I just trim them. When I'm trimming these, what I do is I am looking on the left side of the guard of my ruler, And I usually have a little bit of the bottom of the sentiment showing so that I can make sure that it is nice and even on that ruler or on the blade. And then once I'm done trimming that one side, I will flip it over and I'll do the same thing, but I'm also, for the second side, I'm also paying attention to what is on the left side of the guard, looking at it against the metal part right on the side of that trimmer there, making sure that that area is nice and even as well. You can do it really, really close to the sentiment. I tend to do it a little bit farther away to start. And then if I want to do it a bit closer, then I can re-put it or put it back into my trimmer and just trim a little bit more off. By having those solid hot foiled sentiments, I have 2 times the choice for creating when I'm assembling my cards. So I always love doing that solid hot foiling at the same time. It just gets double duty out of your foil, as well as the fact that sometimes a solid hot foiled sentiment or a solid hot foiled image is just better for the design that you're doing. So like I said, when I started foiling, I didn't think I was going to be using the background that I did with the BetterPress of the month. I had something else planned, but I just really loved the contrast between these two. And I also really liked the fact that there is a hexagon die in this set. So I am going to cut out the 4 hexagons in the center. I am using some Best Ever Craft tape to tape it to my background so that that die doesn't move. And I'm also very careful where I put that tape. I want to make sure that tape isn't somewhere where I'm going to see. So I'm putting it on the outside of the hexagon on an area that is going to be covered by the piece on top of it. These hexagons are going to be overlaid on my foiled background. So this background here, the solid hot foiled piece, is going to be the mat around that foiled piece. So it's not going to be seen on the front of the card. So because this inside part here is going to be covered, I might as well get double duty out of it. I might as well do my die cutting out of it and use that on the front of the card. Another option would be to do a second foiling of that background and then a second solid hot foiling. But rather than use up that foil and cardstock, this is just a way to stretch it out a little bit more. If you've seen any of my videos, you know I do this regularly on my mats. I will regularly die cut things out of it, especially when I'm using specialty cardstocks, because they tend to be a little bit more on the pricey side. So it's always nice to find ways to stretch it just a little bit. So for this card, I also want to use both the foiled sentiment as well as the solid hot foiled sentiment. And I thought it would look interesting to have the solid hot foiled sentiment on the foiled background and then the foiled sentiment on the solid hot foiled hexagons. Sorry, I lost my words there. So for my background here, just to add a little bit of dimension to it, I have a Rusty Hinge distress pad, and I'm just doing a little bit of ink blending around the outside of the card. I do a lot of ink blending in the cards for these clubs. It just gives it a little bit more of a cozy, warm look to it, in my opinion. And in my opinion as well, fall is kind of about cozy, especially with the backgrounds being like this one here, as well as the 3D embossing folder of the month, kind of looking like a quilt. Like I just kind of thought a cozy look was perfect. So I glued that solid hot foil piece onto my A2 card base, and then I glued my foiled and ink blended background. I'm gonna first glue down my solid hot foiled sentiment here, and this is how I just worked it out, just to make sure that the words were gonna line up properly. I put the hexagon on top of where I wanted it to go, glued down that sentiment, and because I'm using liquid glue, I'm using Barely Art glue in a fine tip bottle, I can move it a little bit just to do a little bit of adjusting. Then I can use my scissors to trim down that excess and make sure that I have perfect placement. There is a little space between these hexagons, so there is a tiny little bit of wiggle room for putting it on the front of the card, so I can wiggle it that way just to make sure that my words line up. I wanted it to have just a little bit of dimension here, so I'm using some foam tape on the back of these hexagons just to give it that dimension. Another option would be to take some scrap cardstock and use that hexagon die to die cut them and then place those or glue those behind these hexagons, and you can get some dimension that way as well. The foam tape is just a little bit easier. So the first one I'm going to glue in place is the one where I want the sentiment to line up. I can adjust everything else around that. I didn't want to do the other ones and have the placement not be perfect for that sentiment there. So because I already have that foam tape on the back of them, it just is a matter of pulling that off and then gluing it on top. And I'm trying to make sure that my spacing in between all of those hexagons is even. The last step here is I wanted to add one of those wax seals. Because the foiled background here is fairly bold, I do use the one that I colored the owl black. I think it does tie in with this particular card. It doesn't look out of place. Again, I would prefer it if it was a dark brown. I think it would go just a touch better, but because of the bold, solid, hot foiled hexagons there, I think it works well with that look and with that particular card. And it's a complete design that is not my typical thing at all, but sometimes it's fun to do things that are not typical. So before I go any further with any cards, one of the things that I wanted to do for one of my cards is emboss the BetterPress of the month. I always love background patterns for press plates that can be embossed. So I'm using the stacking on my Platinum 6 machine for embossing a die cut. And there is the stacking right on the bottom press plates there. So there's no guesswork to it. You can just follow the directions there. And I've never done it before, but I thought it would be interesting. No, actually, I think I have done it once before, but it's not something I do often. I thought it would be interesting to emboss the Glimmer of the month. After seeing how it foiled and how bold it was, and I had a feeling that it wasn't really going to work for the feel that I wanted for a lot of my cards, I thought it would be interesting to emboss it and use that as a background. And I love how it turned out. Again, it's just a very simple pattern, that background, but it has a really cool look to it. And when you emboss these plates, you can use either side. One side has a lot more detail. It's the side that goes right against that press plate or that glimmer plate, but you can use the other side if it works better for what you're doing. So I'm going to set those two backgrounds aside. I will be using them towards the end. Well, I'm going to be using the Glimmer of the Month embossed piece at on my last card. The other one, it'll be kind of in the middle of the video. The next thing I want to do though is stamp some sentiments. So anytime I have a new clear stamp set, I take a white eraser, and I just have this white eraser on my desk. It's one that it just gets used for this, so I don't have anything else on it. I rub it over the stamping surface of the stamp and then use a brush to clean off any possible eraser bits. It just removes any possible manufacturing residue, helps the stamp take ink just a little bit better. And when I open up a stamp to use one, or a set to use one stamp, I just do it to the entire set. So I know if I've used any of the stamps in that set, I've done the entire set. I don't need to do it again. This step only needs to be done one time. So to stamp these sentiments, I'm using Vintage Photo Distress ink, and I will stamp it a couple times. I'm using my Misty stamping tool, and I love it, especially for sentiments like this, because if I don't get a clear stamping the first time, I can do it as many times as I need to make sure that I have a nice, clean, crisp stamping. Then I'm using the coordinating dies. Not every single sentiment has a coordinating die. The ones that are single sentences, you can just use your trimmer to trim them down. The ones that have multiple lines to them, I said single sentence, but I meant single lines. The ones that have multiple lines to them are ones that have coordinating dies to them. So I tape them on there with some Best Ever Craft tape. For this, I use the thinner of the Best Ever Craft tapes. I just prefer it for this particular use, and I reuse those pieces of tape several times, probably about a half a dozen times till it doesn't really stick anymore. So it does go a long way by reusing those tape pieces more than once. Then I run it through my Platinum 6 machine to die cut them. Now, I just stamped every single sentiment in that clear stamp of the month. I don't know which ones I'm going to use. I end up using all of them, but I always love when I'm creating to have lots of choice. When I do my wax seals, I always make sure to have more than I think I'm going to use, just in case I change my mind while I'm creating, because that happens often. Same with my backgrounds. I'll often do more backgrounds than I really need, because sometimes I will, again, change my mind and decide something else that I hadn't really planned while I was starting out. It's much easier to do a couple extra backgrounds while you've got the Glimmer machine out, or a couple extra wax seals while the wax is all warm and the set is all out, than to have to stop what you're doing and stamp a separate sentiment and just do individual sentiments while you're working. Much easier to do them all at once. If I have any extra ones left, I just put them in Ziploc bags, put them within that set. Next time I'm using that set, if by chance the sentiments that I already have done work for the color palette that I'm doing, fantastic. I know that if I am going to be using that particular set, that's the first place to look for any extra pieces. So for this card, I'm going to be using that embossed BetterPress of the month. So I trimmed it down to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches. I'm using my rusty Hinge distress pad just to do a little light ink blending around the edges, just to give it a little bit of a frame around it. Then I have a piece of Hammermill cardstock here that I trimmed down to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. And I'm going to use that vintage photo distress ink around that. Now I could have used some solid cardstock here. I do have a bunch of die cuts towards the end of the video from the different die of the month kits that I have done out of solid cardstock. But for the most of the cards, a lot of the mats that I create, I do ink blending with it, because I'm doing a lot of ink blending for the images and for the backgrounds. I just like the matte to have ink blending as well, because then the color isn't completely solid. It has a little bit more interest to it. For a focal element on this card, aside from my background and my sentiment, I die cut one of the leaves from the large die of the month out of some white cardstock. And then I'm using the Fossilized Amber Distress Pad, the Rusty Hinge Distress Pad, and then the Vintage Photo Distress Pad in order to ink it. I thought it looked really kind of cool as a white leaf on the beeswax background, but it's not really realistic, and I wanted it to have a little bit more of a realistic and a warm look to it, and I just love the way it turned out with that ink blending. So this card itself is a very, very simple one. We have a simple mat around it, a really simple embossed background with that BetterPress of the month, but it really looks like a quilt. I don't know my quilting terms, but it looks like one of those quilts that doesn't have a lot of obvious pattern. It has tone on tone with the stitching, just different patterns, but it looks really, really cool. The leaf just adds another element of interest to it, and then I add one of the sentiments and glue that down. And I'm using that Barely Art glue for gluing everything. I love the fact that with the liquid glue you can move and shimmy things into place, and it dries fairly quickly. Now, one of the sentiments from that clear stamp and die set says, "Hope your night glows with magic." Now, if that is not an invitation to do something for one of the cards that glows, I don't know what is. So I pulled out my Grit Paste Glow. I hadn't planned this when I first started creating this video, but again, it was just the perfect opportunity. I took a palette knife, put it on some Hammermill cardstock, and set that aside to dry while I was creating other cards. We will use it for one of the elements on one of the cards towards the end of this video, but we need to make sure that that paste has completely dried on that cardstock before we even attempt to die cut it. It's much easier to put that paste on just a piece of cardstock and then do the die cutting afterwards than try to die cut something and then get an even amount of paste on it without getting it everywhere. And I tend to be a little bit messy when it comes to things like paste and stuff like that. So this is the perfect way. Put it on cardstock, set it aside completely dry, and then you can easily die cut it. So for my next background, I'm using the Caboodle stencil for this month. So this coordinates with the clear stamp of the month. Now, the clear stamp of the month is half of the pattern on this stencil. So either you can take that clear stamp of the month, stamp it, and then use the stencil to color everything in, and likely we'll have to adjust where that stencil goes because the chance of stamping it absolutely perfectly spaced to work with the stencil, I think, is fairly low. Or you could do what I'm doing here, use the two stencils in that Caboodle stencil set, ink that background, then stamp the pattern. And you will have to stamp that pattern twice to fill that whole background. And then once that pattern is stamped, we're going to go back with that sticky mat and our stencil and fill in the rest of the pattern. And it will make a little bit more sense as I work on it. It's an interesting way that they did this rather than having either a stencil or a stamp that did the entire thing, which I don't think they would have had space to do that, plus all of the sentiments that are in that clear stamp set. So I think it was kind of a smart way to do it, but it's just a different way of working with a stamp and stencil background. So I am using different distress inks here. I'm using the Rusty Hinge that I've already used. I'm using the Vintage Photo that I've already used, as well as the Fossilized Amber that I've already used. I'm also pulling in some peeled paint distress ink, as well as barn door distress ink, just to have a really nice color palette here. And I tried choosing colors that went with the cardstock that I had cut for the different dies of the month. So that was part of the ways that I chose the colors. The only one that kind of falls out of that is the candied, or the barn door, the red. I don't really have any red die cuts. I have some dark pink ones, but I didn't have any ink that coordinated with that. And there was a few things on these that just, to me, should be a red color. So once I'm done stenciling that background, I use my Misty stamping tool in order to line up my stamp and stamp that a couple times, make sure I have a nice clean stamping. Then I use a damp cloth to clean off the ink, as well as a dry microfiber cloth in order to dry my stamp. Then I can match up the rest of the pattern on that background. Once I have that matched up, I can close the door to my Misty and I can stamp that a couple times. So that way we have a full background here. I don't have to guess at what the spacing is between those stamps, because I know it's going to work with that stencil because I've already stenciled that background. And I really like the way that background ended up looking. You could, again, you could stamp your two images and then do your stenciling. You would still have to move your stencil in order to get that second image colored. This is just the way that made the most sense in my brain. Now, one thing that I didn't mention when I did my first stenciling is these stencils are just a little bit bigger than a piece of 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inch cardstock. So even though I'm using my sticky mat, there's not a whole lot of area for that stencil to stick to that mat, especially when I have that stencil over my whole background. So I like to use some painter's tape. Any tape will work. Even strips of scrap paper would work. And I just do kind of registration marks. Here I'm doing on the top two corners. When I had it over the whole background, I did the top left corner and the bottom right corner. That way I can easily line up my second stencil without having to, hand line up each one of them. This particular set, there's only 2 stencils to it, so it really wouldn't be that big of a deal to just line it up each time because of the only 2 layers. But when you have a stencil set that has, say, 4, 5, 6 layers to it, it's definitely a lot easier to have those little registration marks like the painter's tape in the top left and bottom right corner, just to make it really easy to line up the different layers and not have to do it on your own. So after that first stenciling is done, and I go and move my paper on my sticky mat, move it up so that I can put the stencil towards the bottom. I can make sure to put that painter's tape where those corners are. I have a couple extra pieces of painter's tape just to tape down the sides, just to make sure that they don't move on me while I'm doing that inking. I did not clean my stencil between doing the first stencil layering and the second one, so I can see right on my stencil which colors I used for what, and I'm using those same colors again, so I'm not contaminating any ink. It makes it really easy to do those layers simply because I already know what color I did the first one. I have my brushes right to the side. For most of the ink blending, I don't even put that ink or put my brush right back into ink because I still have ink on that brush. There's also a little bit of ink left on that stencil that as I'm doing this inking, it's pulling that onto the paper as well. Now, if I was doing this and I found that I wasn't getting a lot of ink on there, I could easily go and grab that pad and dip the brush right into it just to make sure that I had as much ink as I wanted. So here is the finished background, and you can see that not every image for this background is colored. I really liked the way it looked like that. You could, if you want, use, say, some Tombow markers or whatever markers you like to color and color in the rest of the images if you wanted. But I like the fact that some of them aren't colored. I think it looks really interesting. Now, the die set that goes with this clear stamp of the month does have dies for some of these images. I didn't check to see if it's for all of them. So if you want to die cut these pieces out, you absolutely can. I just love the look of this background and wanted to use it as is. So I have a piece of carrot cardstock here that I have trimmed to 4 inches by 5¼ inches. My stamped and stenciled background there, I have trimmed to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches. I'm going to glue those onto my A2 card base, and then I'm going to add my sentiment to the bottom. I did do ink blending on that sentiment with the Fossilized Amber Distress Pad. I just thought it was going to show up a little bit better on that background if it was colored rather than left as the white. I chose the Fossilized Amber because I wanted to make sure that I could still really see the stamp sentiment well. You could choose whatever color you want, but I would definitely recommend not choosing a color that's too dark. Now, the card could have been left as is without doing this next step, but I always love when things have just a little bit of extra texture to them, and sometimes that texture is sparkle. So I'm using some Stardust Stickles here, just adding it to just different areas of my background. I'm not doing it to everything. To me, less is more. I don't want it on everything. I want it just in some different areas. So I have it as the center of the sunflower, the dots on the mushrooms, some of the areas of some of the acorns. So just a few different areas. For the repeat pattern, I made sure that they had the same stickles in the same area. I can set that aside to completely dry and start working on my next background. So for this background, I'm going to be using that embossing folder of the month. This is the Autumn Breeze, and I'm just going to do a random inked background. And I'll tell you right now, it's going to look like a hot mess before it starts to make any sense, but you'll see it coming together fairly soon. So I start off with the Fossilized Amber ink pad, then I go in with the peeled paint. Again, we're putting colors in different areas. I'm just covering that entire background with color. It doesn't really matter which color you put where. The only thing that I tried to make sure not to do was put the red right next to the green, because I wanted to have more fall vibes than, say, Christmas vibes. So I tried to make sure to have the red just by the orange color. Now, what I didn't realize while I was inking was that I'm using the red brush on the rusty Hinge pad, and it wasn't until I went to go do the barn door one that I realized what I had done. It's totally fine. Again, this background doesn't make any sense until you see what I'm going to do to it, not next, but after that. So we have our background here. I wanted to add just a little bit of visual texture to it, so I took my Mighty Mister, squirted some water in my hand, and then just flicked it on the background. This is Distress ink. It's water reactive. So what that's going to do, it's going to lighten up some areas. I'm going to get some random splatter there. It's going to lighten up those areas. And I only let it sit for a few seconds and then grabbed my paper towel and dried it up. Next, I'm going to tape this into my embossing folder. I'm using the Autumn Breeze embossing folder. This is the one with the leaves on the background. What I taped it to was the side where the leaves are raised. The other side, the background is raised and the leaves are recessed. I wanted to ink that with that Vintage Photo Distress Pad. And by having that paper taped to the embossing folder, I don't have to worry about it moving and shifting on me. I can only concentrate on inking that background. So I'm going to repeat this process multiple times. Typically when I'm doing backgrounds like this, about 3 times is the sweet spot. I do it more for this one because I want to make sure that I have a lot of that brown in the background. I want that to get nice and dark so that my leaves are nice and bright and show up really, really well on that background. Now, because I'm using the Vintage Photo, it's not quite as dark as some of the brown distress colors, but I didn't want to introduce more distress colors than was necessary, and this was going to be the only background where I would use something darker. But if you were just doing this particular background, I would maybe use like the Scorched Timber, something that's really, really dark. You could also use black if you wanted, but I wanted to keep with the fall vibe, so I wanted to be more brown than black. But you can see by doing this multiple times, I add layers to that brown. Those leaves stay nice and bright because they're not getting ink on them, but it's just a fun way to really bring out the color of that background. Once I'm done with it, I take my trimmer and I trim that down to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches. I have a piece of beeswax cardstock that I trim down to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. Now, one thing to note is this is the one instance where I don't reuse the tape. You could take a cloth and wipe that tape, the ink off that tape before removing it from the cardstock. I just don't bother. I take that tape off and I toss it because it has ink on it and I don't want a chance getting ink on other projects. So that's one time where I use the Best Ever Craft tape and I just toss it right afterwards. Once I have those layers on my background, I pick which sentiment I want, ink it with the Fossilized Amber Distress ink, and then I can glue that to my card. And we have a really simple but beautiful card with those colorful leaves on that background. And I just love the way this technique works on this particular embossing folder. I think it just looks beautiful, perfect for fall, and it was really easy to do. You can do it whatever fall color palette you want. You could even do a spring color palette if you wanted to do some spring leaves, and that would work fine as well. For my next card, I'm going to use the 3D embossing folder of the month. This is the Patchwork one. And because I think it looks like a quilt, that's what my inspiration is for what I'm going to do to it. So I'm using the stacking on my Platinum machine for embossing a 3D embossing folder, run it through. I'm using white Hammermill cardstock here. You can use whatever cardstock you want, but I knew I wanted to ink blend on it, and I knew I like ink blending on Hammermill cardstock. So this next step could be done in a couple different ways. What I'm doing is taking some painter's tape and I'm taping off different areas. Now, before putting that painter's tape onto my cardstock, I am putting it on my shirt a couple times to take some of the excess sticky off of it. You definitely want to do that with the painter's tape because it will stick really, really well to your paper, and you want to try to make sure as best as possible that you can get it off really well. Once I have that stuck down, I am just basically blocking off different areas of the squares of this background in order to do the ink blending. And I'm doing that ink blending with Fossilized Amber, the peeled paint, as well as the Rusty Hinge. So I'm only using those 3 colors. Now, I said that there was a couple different ways this could be done. Another way is if you have a square die set and one of those squares from your die set matches the size of the squares on this background, you could create a mask with that, whether using paper or masking magic sheets, that sort of thing. You could do that and then just move that square around. I kind of thought this way was just going to be the easier way for everything. My tape, after using it one time, doesn't really want to stick to the long strips of tape I have going down there, mainly because there's ink on there. So I do start using my dry microfiber cloth and removing some of that excess ink. I'm also just using the hands or my fingers from my left hand just to hold that tape down, just to mask it off a little bit. Another option here, instead of putting tape to do the vertical pieces, would be to just use pieces of, say, printer paper and just hold it down just to mask off different areas. I wanted this to look like a worn quilt, so that's why I'm doing the ink blending on it, because it has just a little bit of a worn look to it. Another way I think would be fun to do this background would be to emboss several sheets of colored cardstock and then use your trimmer to trim down the pieces and then do some paper piecing with them. I think that would look really cool too, but I really love the way this looked at the end. Now, the only thing that I would add to this at the end would be if I had a brown fine marker. I think it would be interesting to add, say, sewing lines to the different areas, like between where the different colors are. I don't do this because I don't have a brown marker. The closest thing I have is black, and just like before, I think black is a little bit too stark against this, so I just opt to not do this at all. But I think that would be a great addition. You may have seen that when I pulled that tape off, it did pull a little bit of the white cardstock. The first time lifting it up is the only time that happens. It doesn't happen again, but that's why you definitely need to put this on your shirt or take some of the sticky off the tape before doing this. Another option I think that would work would be to use some Post-it notes or something like that. Just something to mask off the different areas. Now, the one thing that I'm doing while I am inking is I'm making sure that I don't have the same color square beside each other. So when I did the second row here, the bottom square there was right beside a yellow and an orange one, so I did it green. Same with the top one there. This one that I'm doing right now is right beside an orange and a green one, so I'm doing yellow. I opted to just do 3 colors here because I thought it was going to be the easiest way to do it. And once again, just like my other background, I didn't want to put red in here and have it look a little bit too Christmassy. I wanted to make sure it very much had fall vibes, and by just doing these 3 colors, I can ensure that. So with my second row done, I can move my pieces here once again and mask off the 2 outer strips. So obviously I don't need 2 strips for each one, so I can put one on one side, one on the other side, and then just use those short pieces of tape across. And you can see that my short pieces of tape really don't want to stick anymore. I could use new ones while doing this, but because I intend to throw these away anyways, I might as well just keep using them. If it wants to lift up, I can just hold it in place. And typically when it wants to lift up, it's because there's ink on the vertical pieces of tape, and it just really doesn't want to stick. Even though I'm taking my dry microfiber cloth to clean up the next bit of ink, it just doesn't really want to cooperate with that, which is totally fine. So while it looks like it might be frustrating, it's really not that big a deal. I can easily hold down the different pieces of tape just to make sure that I have those lines as crisp as possible to create the look that I want. Now, as I'm doing the inking, I am trying to make sure to have my ink heavier around the outside edges, lighter toward the inside parts. Like I said before, I wanted it to look like more of a worn quilt look. So by making sure that my ink is heavier in some areas and lighter in others, I'm achieving that look to it. Now I have a full piece of 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inch or a quarter sheet of Hammermill cardstock here. You could cut this down to the finished size that you want, but I always like to have a piece or work on a piece that's a little bit bigger. So if there's an area that I like more than others, I can pick and choose that when I'm trimming it down. Typically when I'm trimming something like this down, I like to try to make it as even as possible so that my 2 thinner strips on the sides are more evenly spaced than if by chance I had trimmed it down before embossing it. The other thing too is sometimes when you're embossing, it skews the measurements or skews the side of your paper or size of your paper. So by having it a little bit bigger to begin with, doing my ink blending and then trimming it down when I'm done, I can make sure that it's the right size or the right finish size. And I can also make sure that the space or the pieces that I really like and want to be shown on the front of the card are going to be shown. So with my sides done, I'm ready to go. There is a thin little white line that is in the middle of one of those rows there. This is where using a marker to add some stitching, that would cover that up. I'm not really too worried about it. I don't really necessarily mind that, but another way would be to be a little bit more careful with your tape. I thought I was careful with my tape and I thought I was being very precise with it, but once it's totally done and you can see that there's a little thin white line there, I wasn't quite as precise as I wanted to be. So once again, I'm using my brown, my vintage photo here for the mat around here. So that is trimmed to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. And once again, I'm doing the ink blending. I just like the look of ink blending with ink blending, but if you wanted it more solid, you could either be heavier with the ink or you could use a solid piece of cardstock for that mat. For the look of the rest of the cards, I just like the look of the ink blending for that particular mat for these cards. So I'm also doing a little bit of ink blending on my sentiment so that that coordinates with the mat around the outside as well. So with all of my pieces ready to go, I can assemble my card here. So I glue down that mat first and then glue down my embossed piece. Now doing that ink blending might be a little bit more time consuming than you want it to be. And it's not everyone's cup of tea. I just really love the look of it. And that palette, I've got a fall palette here because it goes with the rest of the cards that I'm doing, but you can easily change that palette to whatever you want. I do add the wax seal because I just think it adds a nice finishing touch as well as some extra dimension to it. But I think this would be fun in baby colors, is like a baby quilt for a card for a new baby. I think that would be a fun way to use it as well. So when I'm gluing down these wax seals, I'm using the wax seal circle adhesive circles for gluing them down. I also sometimes will use my Barely Art glue to glue them down. Then you have to wait for it to completely dry. But by using those wax seal adhesive circles, you don't actually have to wait for it to dry. It's a great way to just glue something down and not have to wait for something to dry. For my next card, I'm using the stencil of the month. This is called Acorns and Oaks. I have another piece of Hammermill cardstock here. This is 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inches. Once again, I'm doing a whole background here, and then once I'm completely done, I will trim that down. So just like the caboodle stencil, there's not a whole lot of space around the edges of this stencil, and I want to make sure that it doesn't move and shift on me while I'm doing my ink blending. So I take a piece of painter's tape and tape the top and tape the bottom. You don't need to do any more than that, just to make sure that that stencil doesn't move. Some of that stencil will be held by the sticky mat, but because there's not a large area of it, this just ensures that we don't have any areas that come undone while I'm moving that stencil brush around. So I'm going to use all of the colors from the palette that I have been working with for this video. So I start off with that Fossilized Amber. I go in with the Rusty Hinge. I'm not doing all of the colors for every single layer, but I am using all 5 colors for this particular background. So I just did those 2 colors for those leaves. The second stencil also has leaves on it. So I line that up. Now these stencils have little registration marks on all 4 corners. So it shows you the size of a 4 1/4 by 5.5 inch piece of cardstock. Makes it really easy to line up. You could use the same method that I used with the other stencil and just do painter's tape on the top right corner or top left corner and bottom right corner and then line it up that way. But because there is registration marks right in this particular stencil, I don't bother with it because it makes it really easy to just line up those particular marks. And this background here, it doesn't matter for the leaves if you're like 100% perfect, but I still had the placement correct anyways. It wasn't anything that wasn't out of line as I was working. For this layer, I'm using the Fossilized Amber as well as the Rusty Hinge, but then I also pull in that barn door. I want to add a little bit of that red to these leaves. Because we have 2 different stencils with leaves, I thought it would be interesting to have them just a little bit different. For my next layer, I'm using the Vintage Photo. This is for some of the detail on the leaves as well as some of the detail for the acorns that are on this background. When I do this stenciling, I don't make sure that I have a completely even layer of my ink. I will regularly make some areas lighter and some areas darker, mainly because, in my opinion, it looks a little bit more interesting. That might not be everyone's cup of tea, and that's totally fine, but I do think it just gives it a little bit more interest if some areas are lighter and some are darker. Now the next layer stencil, number 4, I am doing that one last. So this is technically the 5th layer, and I'm doing this with that same Vintage Photo. This has the detail for the other leaves as well as some more of the detail for the acorns. Now this has the bottom part of the acorns, and whenever I do the ink blending for those, I'm trying to be heavier on the top and lighter towards the bottom. Once again, just giving it some visual dimension and just making it look a little bit more interesting. That stencil that I skipped over, I'm also going to ink that with this Vintage Photo. This has got other detail for the acorn, but I also want to use some Moon Dust Stickles glitter gel for that particular layer. So I do that last so that I don't have any more stenciling to do after I'm done that. I can let that glitter gel completely dry. So I ink it with the Rusty Hinge ink just so that it's a little bit different from the rest of the color from the acorn. The acorn, rest of the colors were just that Vintage Photo, and if I did the Vintage Photo, it would look good, but it would be just a little bit, it wouldn't stick out as much. So I did the Rusty Hinge first, and then I did Vintage Photo over top of it just to give it a little bit of a different color. And then I'm taking a palette knife and I'm going to use that Moon Dust Stickles glitter gel. Now this doesn't have any color to it. It just has an opalescent glitter, similar to the Stardust Stickles that I regularly use on different areas of cards, and I used it on that stamped and stenciled background. But because I've done ink blending below it, it's going to that ink is going to show through, and we're just going to have some extra texture as well as sparkle from that glitter. So I'm going to let that completely dry. I'm leaving that on the mat to completely dry, and right away I go and clean off my stencil. I don't want that gel to dry on my stencil, and I also clean off my palette knife just to make sure that everything is nice and clean. If you let it dry on there, you probably could get it off, but you would have to use a lot more force and elbow grease and possibly damage your stencil. So after that it completely dried, I realized that one of the details of my leaves, that one towards the center, wasn't totally finished, so I stenciled that in. Because that gel was completely dry, I could easily do that and not worry about making a mess of anything. The other thing that I had realized was I wanted to use the sparkle splatter effects on just the leaves, just to give them a little bit more interest, as well as something that would catch the light when you tilt it into the light. I had forgotten to do that for the first layer, so I can easily just lay that right on there and do that. The sparkle splatter effects, it comes in two different colors. Sparkle is the light color. It doesn't have color to it, but it has like a silver shimmer to it. It's really, really pretty and perfect for, say, snowy backgrounds or wintry backgrounds. And then there's also Raven splatter effects, and I'll use that in one of my upcoming cards. I'm going to use it in this video. That has a black color to it, and then the shimmer is gold to it. So it's got a pretty look to it as well. Perfect, again, for Halloween cards as well. So with my background done, and that splatter effects takes really not much time to dry. I want to say like 15-20 seconds and it's dry. It dries really, really quickly. I can ink blend my background here, or my mat. So this is trimmed to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. Once again, I am inking it with the Vintage Photo. You could do any of the colors of the background. Because my sentiments are stamped with the Vintage Photo, I just kind of like how doing the matte in that color just ties it in with the sentiment as well. After ink blending that matte, I can trim down my stenciled image here to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches. Another option would be to not have a matte and just glue this stenciled background right onto the front of a card. But I always love mattes. I just like the way they frame things in. And for that stenciled background, I think it looks a little bit more interesting with the pattern going off of the outside of the card. It looks more like a printed paper. So I glue that down and then pick which sentiment I want for my background. And then I decide if I want to put a wax seal on here. Like I said before, I had only planned on using 1 wax seal, but in the end I used 3. And that's one of the reasons why when I'm creating at the beginning of my videos, I do extras. I only showed me creating 1 wax seal. And I cut the rest out when I was editing my video because I realized how long it was going to be. But by having those extra ones there, I can change my mind while I'm creating. I can decide that something needs just a little bit of extra texture. I opted to go for one of the wax seals that didn't have any extra ink on it, that I didn't use that POSCA marker on it, because the black of the POSCA marker just it didn't really tie in with the background there. So by having one that didn't have that ink on it, it was perfect. It adds that extra detail there. And when you tilt it in the light to see the detail from the wax seal, you also get that sparkle from the Moon Dust Stickles glitter gel, as well as the sparkle splatter effects. So for my next card, I am going to first take that background that I did the grit paste glow on. I'm going to die cut the ghosts from the die of the month. This also die cuts the skull. And then there's an oval in this die set to fill in behind it for the eyes as well as the mouth. And I will die cut that off screen because it's just die cutting an oval. That same oval works for both the ghost as well as the skull. It also works for the cat, which I will use, I think, in my next card. To glue them down, I just put the glue right on the back of the skull face, and then I put the oval right behind it. It fills in all of those areas all at once, nice and easily. So I'll put that aside to completely dry, and this is something that I hadn't planned when I was die cutting my ghosts. I knew I had wanted 3 ghosts. I had only planned on using 1 skull. I end up using the other 2 on the inside of the card. But after doing that and after assembling those ghosts, I'm like, you know what? It would be really cool if the features of the pumpkin also glowed, the eyes and the mouth. I thought that would be really cool. Now, fortunately, I had a area that had most of that grit paste glow on there, so I could use the shadow die from the pumpkin and die cut that out. It's not completely covered in that grit paste, but I'm going to take the pumpkin top and just kind of tilt it off center to cover some of the area that doesn't have that grit paste glow. I had already wanted to have that top on there and have the ghost coming out of the top of the pumpkin, so this just gets me to be a little bit creative. Now, the one thing that I was rubbing off of that background after die cutting that pumpkin, I had just die cut the black ovals to go behind the ghost as well as the skulls. So I got some cardstock residue from my machine on my plates, and first I rubbed it with my fingers and it wasn't coming off. I just used my damp microfiber cloth and it came right off and came nice and clean. So for some of the details for the background of this card. I have the leaves die cut out of some rainforest cardstock. I'm adding some ink blending with the peeled paint distress ink just to give it a little bit of visual dimension. There's also some florals for this card that I have die cut, but I'm not adding any ink blending to that. I opted to just leave them totally flat because there's a whole lot of detail that is going into this card. So there were some areas that didn't need any extra ink blending. Now I'm ready to start assembling these die cuts. So I start with the little cheeks of the pumpkin, and I have that die cut out of some Silicone Cardstock. Then the shadows for the eyes and the mouth are die cut out of some Raven cardstock. So I put a little bit of glue on the back side of that pumpkin die cut, and then I can put those die cuts in there. And I have that flipped over to the front so that I can make sure that that little shadow piece is nice and even where it is supposed to go. Once I have those shadow pieces glued on, I can glue on the background of that pumpkin. So I'm using that Barely Art glue for everything. It works perfectly, not only for big die cuts, but it also works for small die cuts as well as gluing my cards together. And I use it for pretty much every card. I use it, I want to say like for 95% of the stuff. There's the odd thing that it doesn't work well for, but I use it for most things. So with my background glued down on that pumpkin, I can put that top on towards the right side. That's the side of the shadow that didn't have any grit paste glow on there. You'll never know because it's completely covered. So I tried to show you the glow on there, and it really didn't work because I have 3 different lights I have to turn off, and I also have a window in my room. It really didn't show up well. I'll show you in a minute when the card is done, and then you'll get a better idea of the glow from this card. Or you can go to my blog post on my website, and I have a picture of the card that showed the glow really, really well. So it's a fun surprise feature that I don't think anyone expects. And if you give your card to someone and they don't know it, what I would do is put a little Post-it note on the inside and then just say, hold it to the light and then turn the light off, just to kind of give them an idea that there's something on there that's unexpected. And if you've given the card to someone in an envelope, obviously that glow hasn't charged up yet. So you want to hold it to a light first and let that glow part charge up and then turn the light off. So before I put my ghosts in, I want to put some of the greenery on the background there. So I have these bud sprigs, I'm not even sure what they're supposed to be, that I glue behind there. And this is one of the great things about using liquid glue. Even when I have some of these pieces down, I'm not pushing them down all the way so that I have some wiggle room to tuck something in behind it. While I'm working with florals and foliage, I like to have that bit of wiggle room. If you have a permanent glue that sets right away or you wait for it to totally dry, you don't have the option of sticking anything in behind it. And I wanted to do those florals first before gluing those pumpkin or the ghosts down because I wanted to make sure there was some coverage behind it before having those ghosts there. Now, one thing I didn't mention is I'm just doing this right on my card base. I don't do this very often. I often work on a separate piece of cardstock and then have a mat around it. Again, this was outside of my comfort zone, but if it didn't work, it was just a piece of paper. I could always grab another one, and I really love the way this looks, so I definitely have to do this more often. I just did a little light ink blending on that background with the Fossilized Amber Distress Pad. You could do any color if you wanted, but I just wanted something that was going to show those die cuts off really nicely and something that was a different color from the greenery as well as most of the florals. So with those ghosts in place, I can put my skull there, and then I'm just going to tuck in some of those florals. There is a die in this set for centers to the florals. I opted not to do them. My plan while I was creating was to do little bits of stickles on the centers of the flowers because I often will do that. I now am realizing that I totally forgot to do that. I don't have centers in any of my florals, but because there's so much texture and so much going on with the card, in my opinion, you don't really notice it. And I think the more exciting thing with this card and the more the focal point is the glow in the dark ghost, the glow in the dark features of the pumpkin as well as the skull. So once I have the majority of stuff done, then I can add my sentiment there. I will let everything dry. I put my acrylic block on there just to hold everything nice and flat. Once that's set, I decide to add the other two skulls as well as a little bit of the greenery die cuts that I have left on the inside of the card. I figured we might as well use it up rather than save it. You could obviously save it for a future card, but this was just a fun way to use those pieces up and again have something a little bit unexpected on the inside of the card. And here, probably one skull would have been enough, but because I had two, I thought, why not just add both of them and have both of them on the inside there. So I'll let that dry completely, and here is the finished card. So here's the finished card with the light on. I will go turn the lights off and you get a better idea of that glow. It still doesn't show it as brightly as the picture that I took of it, mainly because of the daylight coming in my window, and I am not really good at filming things at night because by then my brain is just done. So this was done in the middle of the day, but you still get an idea of the glow. For the next card, I'm going to do a combination of the die of the month as well as the large die of the month. So for the large die of the month, I took the leaf dies from that set. I just die cut them out of white Hammermill cardstock, and I'm using the different ink pads that I've been using throughout the video to do some inking on them. Another option here would be to do a distress background with a bunch of the different fall colors. Then you would have a lot of texture and then you could die cut it. I didn't want to do that because I was going to have to wait for that to totally dry. So this was going to get a similar look as to what I wanted, but it was just going to be a little bit quicker. Now, as I'm doing this ink blending, I'm trying to make them all look just a little bit different from each other. So some have only the yellow and green, some have just the orange, the orange and the red, some have the orange and the yellow. Just again, making them look a little bit different because I want to kind of cluster them on a background, but I don't want them to all totally blend together. To add a little bit of interest to it, I'm using that Raven Splatter Effects. This is the one that looks black or has a black look to it, but then it has a gold shimmer to it. So it's just going to add that splatter to the background, and then when you tilt it in the light, it will have that gold shimmer. It'll just add a little bit of interest, and it's also going to coordinate with the other element I'm putting on this card. Like I said before, the splatter effects doesn't take very long to dry, and it's also water soluble. So even though I'm getting this splatter on my sticky mat, it's going to wipe off really, really easily. For my background here, I'm using that Autumn Breeze embossing folder, just embossing it on some Hammermill cardstock, and then I can trim that down for my background. Now you could also use colored cardstock here, but I wanted to make sure that my leaves were going to pop off this background really, really well. So I have a piece of black cardstock that is trimmed to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. My embossed piece here, I trimmed down to 3 3/4 by 5 inches and just used that fossilized amber to add a little bit of ink blending to the background. And you can see that I only did the center part of it. I didn't ink blend it all the way to the edges. I wanted to have it just behind the focal elements of this card. So for the focal piece here, I'm using the cat die from the die of the month. I have it die cut out of some black velvet cardstock just to give it a little bit of texture. If you don't have velvet cardstock, you can just use black cardstock. It comes in, you can get it in black, but you can also get it in a multi-pack. And it's just a really great way. I love using it for different animal die cuts because it just has a beautiful look to it that just, again, it just gives it texture. It gives it something a little bit interesting. So for the features for that cat, I have the nose piece as well as the ears die cut out of Sicily cardstock, and then the oval that I used for the ghost as well as the skull for the background that I did in black. I die cut that out of Rainforest cardstock. When assembling the cat, I put the nose piece in first with the Sicily, so then I could put that oval piece behind it and I wouldn't have a green nose for the cat. So that's a great way to get different colored eyes and nose for him. You could also use just one color that you want for both the eyes as well as the nose, but this is just what worked for the look that I was going for. So with him drying to the side, I can add those leaves to the background. And then once I have my leaves down, I'm going to put the cat in the center of it. So this is where the black matter on the outside, that black splatter on the leaves, as well as my black cat, they all tie in together and they all coordinate really, really nicely. So the last addition to the card is one of my foiled sentiments, and I'm just going to use my ink blending to add some color to it. Now, when I'm doing the ink blending, even if the sentiments, often I'm not doing them completely evenly ink blended. I often will make sure that some areas are a little bit lighter and some areas that are a little bit darker. I still want to be able to read the sentiment really well, but again, to me, it just adds a little bit of interest to it. So with that card done, we're ready to do something else with the large die of the month. So I'm going to create that acorn home as well as the chipmunk. When assembling my acorn piece here, I'm doing all my first layers of the thing. So I have the first layer of the top of the acorn. That is die cut out of some fawn cardstock. And then I have the first layer or the under layer for my window die cut out of beeswax cardstock, and then the under layer or the first layer of the door piece die cut out of that fawn cardstock. Glue all three of those down and then put my acrylic block on top and then start adding the second layers or the detail layers. So the top layer adds detail to the roof of that acorn, then the top layer of the window, the next layer of the door. Now the door itself has several different layers because not only do we have the under layer in the door, but then we also have a window through that door. So with those layers down, I can put that acrylic block on there, make sure everything's nice and flat, and then start working on the other layers. And I love using that acrylic block because not only does it make everything flat, it's also clear. So I can see right through it and I can make sure that my layers haven't shifted as I've been working. I can also create my design on top of that acrylic block and then set it aside and so that I know exactly how I had everything laid out before assembling. While my acorn home is drying, I can assemble my little acorns here. So those are die cut out of some acorn cardstock, appropriate, as well as truffle cardstock. Really easy to assemble. I just put glue on the tops of the acorn bases and then just add the little hats on the top of them. And they take really only a few seconds to start grabbing that glue and drying. Once those pieces are glued together, I can tuck those to the side and let that dry completely. And these are just perfect little additions. One of them is going to be in my little chipmunk's arms, and the rest are just going to be clustered around the little acorn home. Now the last thing to assemble here is my little chipmunk. So I have the base of him die cut out of some cinnamon cardstock. This piece here for his belly as well as the underside of his chin, I have it die cut out of some raven cardstock, but you could also die cut it out of, say, fawn or Sicily cardstock if you wanted it to be lighter in color. There's a piece that goes behind the face to fill in the area for the ear as well as the nose, and it's also the pupil for the eye. I opted to do something a little bit different. I wanted the inner part of the ear as well as the nose to be die cut out of Sicily cardstock. It's an orange that has a bit of a pinky tone to it. And I had already put that white piece for the whites of the chipmunk's eye in there. I didn't want the pupil to be that Sicily color. Now there was two options. Either I could use a marker, the POSCA marker, and color in the part that was going to be the pupil and still have that underneath colored, or I could do what I did here. Is I just used that POSCA marker and I just drew in the pupil. I was going to use that marker anyways. This way I could control exactly where that piece went. Then I set that aside to dry and we're ready to work on the background. And I'm just doing another very simple background. I'm using the Patchwork 3D embossing folder of the month, embossing some beeswax cardstock. It really could be any color cardstock behind here. I chose the beeswax because it coordinated with the inner part of the windows. And I thought that the acorn home would pop off it really nicely. I have a piece of truffle cardstock here that I trimmed down to 4 by 5 1/4. My embossed background here, I'm just using a little bit of that peeled paint distressing just on the center part. This is one of those steps that I'm not sure, like it's okay, but I don't necessarily love that green on top of that beeswax cardstock. The beeswax is trimmed down to 3 3/4 inches by 4 or 5 inches. Most of this ink blending is going to be covered with the acorn house anyways. I think it probably would have been better without that ink blending on it. So I'm going to start at the bottom of the card, put that little area for the grass down, and then I can put my little acorn home down. Then my little chipmunk here, I just want to kind of not glue it down, but just to see how much space I have left. Then glue down my sentiments. So the scripty word says happy, and then there's two different options here. One is the one that I chose was Thanksgiving, and then the other one it was a different sentiment. I don't have the set right in front of me. So there is a couple options to choose from. Obviously, you could either choose one of the foiled sentiments or the BetterPress sentiments or one of the stamp sentiments instead. But I love the fact that there is a sentiment in this set. Next, I'm going to glue the little clumps of grass. I have 4 of them die cut. I want a couple of them behind my piles of acorns, and then I want some kind of growing outside of the piles of acorns. So I have 3 of the different acorns that I'm going to glue to the right side of the acorn home. 2 of them are going to be towards the left, and then the other one is right in the chipmunk's arms. But because the chipmunk is die cut out of cinnamon cardstock and the base of that acorn home is also die cut out of that, by putting those tiny acorns towards the bottom there, I have a break in those colors so that I can see that chipmunk on top of that home or in front of that home, and it doesn't totally blend in. So here's the finished card. Again, really, really simple. I added that ink blending to the background, but I don't think it's necessary. I think you could easily get away without it. And I opted for that Patchwork embossing folder because I had just used the Autumn Breeze one, but I think the Autumn Breeze one would be perfect behind here. Or you could even use solid cardstock. You don't necessarily even need to add that texture to the background, but it does add a little bit of interest there. For just a little bit more texture, I just put some glossy accents in the windows as well as the chipmunk eyes, and then set that aside to completely dry. The last set, or the last card I'm going to create here, is with the stitching die of the month. So this is the Stitch Pumpkin Tops. Absolutely adorable. And once again, I'm going to do a little bit of ink blending before I do the stitching. So I have 1 pumpkin die cut out of carrot cardstock, 1 die cut out of terracotta cardstock, and 1 die cut out of beeswax cardstock. The beeswax one is ink blended with Fossilized Amber Distress ink. The 2 orange ones are ink blended with Rusty Hinge Distress ink. Again, it just gives them a little bit of visual dimension. For a little bit of sparkle, I'm going to use some gold floss for my stitching. You could also use regular floss if you don't want that metallic look to it. I think it just takes it to the next level, and I really love the final look of it. But obviously, you can opt for just using regular floss if you want something that's not quite as flashy. So anytime I'm doing stitching with dies, I take a tiny piece of Best Ever Craft tape and tape down the end of my floss. That way I know it's nice and secure and I don't have to worry about it possibly pulling through. Then I work on my stitching. When you use stitching dies from Spellbinders, they put a little indent when you do your die cutting, so it shows you exactly where they intend for the stitching to go. Most of the time, that stitching is pretty intuitive. It's pretty easy to see exactly where they intend for that stitching to be. And obviously, you can get creative and change it up if you want. Like you could use the outside dots and just kind of do an outside or an outline stitch around the outside edge, and then you could use the inside dots and do an inside stitch if you wanted to change it up a little bit. I really love the look of the final pumpkins by doing it the way that they intended, but obviously it's your card, you can get creative. So once I'm at the end of my floss, I'm once again going to pick a piece of Best Ever Craft tape, and it doesn't need to be a big piece, and then tape down the end of that floss and use my detail scissors to trim off the excess piece. And this particular pumpkin, I didn't get him finished with the floss that I had on my needle, so I'm just going to finish it up, or grab some more floss and finish it up, doing it exactly the same way that I did before. When I start stitching, I use a little bit of that Best Ever Craft tape in order to secure my thread, and once I'm done stitching, I'm going to do the same thing. Now, when I die cut these pumpkins, there's an insert piece as well as an outline piece. I die cut it once with both pieces together for the piece that I'm going to stitch, and then with that same color cardstock, I do a separate one with just the outline piece. That piece, once I'm done my stitching, I'm going to glue it to the back of this, and I do it for 2 reasons. First of all, it secures the floss inside between those 2 layers of cardstock. It also makes it really easy when you're assembling your card together. You're going to be gluing cardstock to cardstock. Gives it a little bit of extra dimension too. So it's something that I like to do, but it's not something that's absolutely necessary. If that's not your cup of tea and you don't want to do that, you don't have to. It's just the way that I prefer to do it. So I take my Barely Art glue and I put it all the way around the outside edges of my die cut there, as well as the inside piece. I have these little quilting sewing clips here that I use around the outside to hold those pieces of cardstock together. You could hold them with your fingers till that glue is dry, but by doing this, I can put that to the side and I can start stitching my next piece. These particular pumpkins, because they're pumpkin tops, they have a green area for the top of the pumpkin as well as a little vine piece. So I glue those pieces on there. Now I didn't ink blend that vine piece, and once my card was done, I wish I had. So if I were to do this card again, I would ink blend just the vine piece. It doesn't need to be the pumpkin top piece, just that tiny little vine piece where that vine meets the pumpkin top. I think it would look great with just a touch of ink blending. It doesn't need to be a lot, but it would tie in really well with the ink blending around the outside of those pumpkins. The other two pumpkins I did off screen because it's exactly the same method as that first pumpkin, and I knew this video was going to be long and I didn't want it to be really repetitive. So I did those off screen and glued them together as well. The next pieces for this particular card are some leaves there that I'm doing a little bit of ink blending on just to add some visual dimension. Then we have our banner, gluing those together. This die set also has some little acorns that I'm gluing those together as well. And for the card that I'm creating, the pumpkins are the focal point, but the leaves and the little acorns, they're going to be tucked behind, and they're just going to add some texture as well as just some visual interest to the background of the card. This set also has a sentiment to go with it. So there is a scripty word that says hello, and then the banner that I glued the front and back to, that says gorgeous, and gourd is spelt G-O-U-R-D. So it's a nice punny sentiment that works really well with those stitched snowflakes there. This is the card that I'm going to use that embossed glimmer background because I thought it would work really well for this particular card. Now I embossed it out of Hammermill Cardstock, and I'm just doing a little bit of light ink blending with that peeled paint distress ink. Most of this is going to be covered with my pumpkins and my die cut, so we're only going to see a little bit, but it's just going to add just a little bit of interest. You could also die cut or emboss colored cardstock if you didn't want to do the ink blending, but the ink blending, again, it just adds something just a little bit more interesting. So gluing those to the base of the card, and this is when I realized that I mis-trimmed my embossed piece there. I didn't trim it down width-wise, so I'm just have that sitting, letting that glue dry completely before I go and trim that down. But while I am waiting for that glue to dry, I might as well not waste my time. This is the type of thing that I will regularly do, and I'll typically do this right on top of my card so I could see my die cuts right on my background to make sure that the layout that I have in my head is exactly what I want to do. And by having it on the acrylic block, after I've done this on top of the card, on top of my background, I can put this to the side, know exactly where I intend to put everything, and assemble it really, really easily. So with my glue dried on my embossed background there, I can trim that down and briefly see how it looks with those die cuts on my background. Now I can use my glue to glue my die cuts. When I'm doing die cuts like this and gluing like this, I do my big main focal point things first, and then I go and tuck in all those extra little leaves and acorns. And because I have this glued with that Barely Art glue, with that liquid glue, it has that bit of wiggle room, so I have that time to tuck things in. I don't have to worry about my glue drying before I have a chance to do that. I also know that I like to tuck things in, so I'll often make sure that my glue is concentrated towards the center, that I don't have a lot of glue around the outside edges to possibly fight with, but I usually don't fight with it because I've done this so many times. I know I can work quickly with this, so I don't have to worry about things drying on me. But if you're new to this and this is your first time doing it, first of all, it helps to kind of place everything where you want it to go first, so you know that you're going to like the finished look. The other thing, concentrate your glue on the inside, and then you don't have to worry about having glue that you're trying to push things against. If you have glue on the inside pieces or the inside areas of these pumpkins, you'll have outer areas with no glue on them that you can easily add your die cuts to. Once you're completely done with this, if you find there's an area that's lifted up that you want it glued down, that fine line bottle there has a really fine tip. You can easily squeeze it underneath your die cuts, add just a little bit of extra glue to glue and secure things down if you need to. So you do have that wiggle room to be able to do that at the end really nice and easily. I've never needed to do that. But it's one of those things, you're new to it, sometimes it's a little bit nerve-wracking trying to work quickly, and by only having the glue on the center of the pumpkins and being able to add those die cuts below, knowing that you could squeeze in a little bit of glue later on if you feel you need it, it takes a little bit of the nerves out of doing it. You can see that because of those stitched pumpkins and all of those extra die cuts behind there, as well as the embossed background, this card has so much fun texture to it. And that gold stitching on the pumpkins, to me, it just takes it to the next level. I love the look of it. It adds that little metallic touch and something that's a little bit unexpected, and it really highlights the stitching on those pumpkins. If that's not your cup of tea, again, you can use plain floss that doesn't have that shimmer to it or that shine to it, and it will look fantastic as well and have a ton of texture to it as well. Then we have our Happy Thanksgiving acorn home with that adorable little chipmunk. And then our black velvet cat with the leaves behind them. This is just a great combination, a great way of using both the die of the month as well as the large die of the month, but you certainly don't necessarily need to combine the two. Then our fun glow-in-the-dark card with that sentiment that inspired it all, hope your night glows with magic. Perfect for the glowing elements of the ghost, the skull, and the pumpkin. Then we have our acorns and oaks stenciled background with that shimmer from the moon dust Stickles glitter gel, as well as the sparkle splatter effects. And those are the things that when you look at that card, you don't see it until you tilt it in the light and it adds those pieces. Then we have our patchwork quilt embossed background, and it totally, to me, looks like a quilt. And next is our Autumn Breeze embossed background with that blackout technique. So simple and so easy to do, but it's really effective and perfect for a fall card. Our stamped and stenciled using the caboodle item. This is just such an adorable card, and like I said before, there are dies for those images, so that would be fun to do little note cards with those tiny little images on as well. Then we have our very simple card with our embossed BetterPress of the month and that little leaf embellishment from the large die of the month. And then our very first foiled BetterPress card that I hadn't planned to make at all, but it ended up being the first card that I made. Thank you so much for joining me today. I know this one was a long one, and if you're still here, I really appreciate all the time you spend with me. I hope you have a fantastic day.